Joining us in the studio to talk about a brand new book. It's called Code Wars, The Battle for Fans, Dollars and Survival. It's written by Hunter Fujak, or Fujak? Fujak, very good. Hunter, great to have you in the studio. I'm a sports nut. My wife will say I'm a sports tragic. I cover and supported and followed sports all around the world. I'm a huge Yankee fan in baseball and a huge Tottenham Hotspur fan in the EPL, and on and on and on it goes. Talk to me about this. How different is Australia's sports landscape to other countries? I mentioned America, I mentioned Britain and others. How does sport differ in Australia to all those other places?
Australia's a really unique sport marketplace. In fact, it's probably the uniquest in the world in the sense that, in most places, soccer is the most popular sport. Where it's not the most popular sport, it's at least the most popular type of football, typically. Australia is the only country in the world where soccer still sits probably third or fourth in terms of aggregate popularity. Wow. The closest run would probably be New Zealand and Ireland.
You don't account for participation, you talk about...
this is when we talk overall interest, whether it be through consumption on television, attendance or participation. So
when people say we have one of the most competitive sports environments in the world, it is true, isn't it? Because the battleground is brutal.
Absolutely. At the moment, we have about 80 football teams across both genders. If we look at more broadly to include netball and basketball.
No, we've only got 25 million
That's
people.
Right, we've got 25 million people. And if we look at the 7 commercial sports overall, we end up with about 120 team sport teams in the Australian market. So in a place like Sydney and Melbourne, that has...
That's huge, eh?
Absolutely. A lot of the sport market consulting agencies have talked about the fact that we have this super high concentration that we perhaps can't sustain into the future. And in terms of exactly monetizing the value of fans, increasingly there are a lot of clubs.
How much does sport mean in Australia?
So it depends on how you define it, but essentially between about 2011 to 2019, our four football codes plus cricket went from $1.1 to $2 billion in central revenue. If we look at the football ecosystem and then include the clubs of the football leagues, it's about a $3 billion ecosystem pre-COVID.
Yes, pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID, and that half of that is the AFL just on its own.
And when we talk about involvement, let's talk about the number of people employed in it. I've watched the AFL, I've watched the Rugby League, the Rugby Union, so to speak, and also the A-League, gather a great many more people at each and every club than I imagined when I first started following all these sports all those years ago, because they weren't professionals, they were all part-timers. They all had to go to work, whether it was male or female, and of course on the weekends they played the sport. Not the case today.
That's right.
You've got doctors, you've got counsellors, you've got physios, you've got mentors, and on and on and on. 55 extra spots that never imagined were going to be there.
That's right. We've gone in about a 40-year span from a kitchen table operation to a very professional operation. With that, we've seen Donikian, where I work, offer sport management degrees specifically to educate people to work in the sector. And again, we won't know the COVID numbers look like, but in recent times, the sector employs over 100,000 people. And in terms of consumer spending, it accounts for 12% of discretionary spending in the leisure category.
Mate, at that rate, there's plenty of skin in the game, isn't there?
Absolutely.
With that many people involved.
Absolutely. And there has to be, when you have that many clubs, that many sports, all balancing their various operations, there are lots of opportunities there.
And I suppose naming rights deals are pretty important for all these sports, vying for just a little bit of an edge from one another?
Of course, and this is where we see the top end of the market really dominate. The AFL, unsurprisingly, has the biggest rights deal, close to $20 million a year per annum with Toyota, and all the rest sort of...
That's been a long time deal, hasn't it?
That's right, as has also been the case with Telstra for the NRL. So really big money in terms of naming rights and sponsorship, and increasingly now with women's sport as well, trying to get on board there.
How much money are we likely to see the women's game bring in, especially understanding now that we're a little over a couple of years away from the Women's World Cup coming down under, going to be shared by Australia and New Zealand? Yep. Surely that's going to push at the edges and change the mix
Yeah,
and I would dare say there'd be sponsors not wanting to miss out.
The most exciting thing for women's sport is the fact that commercial research has shown that consumers have more positive attributes that they give to women's sport around being inclusive, family-friendly and supportive.
Is it that the consumer has changed or opened up and become a little bit more positive to it because of the way the media has changed its narrative towards women's sport? Because I can remember being a part of it for 40 years. You mentioned women's sport and they went, no, not interested.
It's definitely a chicken
can't
and
run
egg
that line
situation.
today.
That's right. It's a chicken and egg situation in the sense that the long held argument was if there was a desire for it, it would media companies would be lining up to broadcast it, monetize it. But then the counter view was, without the exposure, women's sport couldn't launch. So it's historically been a chicken and egg argument. The AFLW in particular was a real circuit breaker that basically shattered that paradigm. And now we're seeing the commercial opportunities for women explode off the back of it.
Tell me something. How did we get to have 4 football codes in this country at the other end of the world?
That's right. And again, this is one area where Australia is such a unique sport marketplace, which is why obviously I've written a book about it. And that is the fact that some of this has happened slightly by accident. So if we go back to the 1850s, Tom Wills is a cricketer who decides that to stay fit they should play football in winter. And all of a sudden we have AFL.
Which football?
That's the Australian Football League, or Australian rules as it's
Aussie
known.
rules, as some people remind us.
Melbourne rules, Victorian rules.
But in South Australia, it's South Australian rules. And in
That's
WA, it's waffle rules.
Exactly, and the book goes through a bit of depth in terms of the history to illustrate how the way our market has been shaped today is really the amalgamation of lots of discrete moments in time in each of our colonies through the 1860s to about the 1880s.
Very parochial, weren't we?
That's right, that's right.
Yeah. So how long have we been playing all these sports? You took us back to the 1800s. When did we first see the Australian rules morph into what we understand today?
Yeah, obviously,
when did that start?
We've got about 600 years of football history between 4 football codes. So obviously the Australian rules dates back to about 1858, was the first club in Melbourne.
Yeah.
It was only a couple of years later in 1863 that the Sydney University Rugby Football Club was formed. That was in fact the first rugby club in the Southern Hemisphere that remains in operation today. We obviously know rugby league formed as a breakaway in England, and then in 1908.
Yeah, in Australia.
And soccer really has been sort of the forgotten history of sorts.
Why was it part of the forgotten history when you consider that the first fleet came from Britain?
That's right.
And Britain was the home of association football. So why did it take so long? Was it because it was so closely associated to Mother England?
There's a lot of research on why it didn't catalyse, and it is surprising because, as you say, there are people who were very much fans of soccer on the boats that arrived here and who continued to arrive here for the better part of 100 years. And really, among the more common explanations is really that the dominant codes in each local area, being Australian rules in Melbourne and rugby in Sydney, the administrators of these codes were really good at using suppression tactics through access to facilities, control of media.
They're still doing it.
And they're still doing it today, which is why, 150 years on, we're still in a code war.
We've got Marvel now owned by the AFL, and if anyone else wants to play on it, they've got to pay up. And there are other grounds, of course, that you can't entertain and to play a game on because the AFL or whoever else is running the code is saying to you, no, we want it. For example, there's a contest this weekend. It was meant to be Western United playing a team at the Geelong at Cardinia Park. And of course, now the AFL has said, no, we've got to get it ready for the new AFL season, which starts, of course, in a week's time.
Well, more broadly, we know that the AFL was very successful in restricting access to infrastructure during our World Cup bids.
Correct,
which really torpedoed that. And that's why for the Women's World Cup, there's in fact basically no games being played in the AFL states because they were too conscious of the stadium issues. And if you look at where the venues are, it's basically all the northern rugby league states.
Wow, okay. Interesting stuff. Had no idea. And I suppose what has helped it morph into being a successful bid was the fact that New Zealand was right there saying, we can do this together.
That's right.
Fantastic stuff. Are we better off being a nation with so much variety?
If you're a consumer, the answer is definitely yes. Because if you live in America and you want to go to an NFL game, the average ticket price for a Los Angeles Chargers game in 2019 was $165 US.
Ouch.
You know, for us, we can still attend.
We're not talking Super Bowl, we're talking about
just
the
a regular game.
Regular game.
And that's the average, so that's expensive tickets average with cheaper tickets, but the point remains here, general admission, we can still go for $20, $30. You can still go to the Australian Open with a day pass and show up on the day of the Australian Open and watch tennis, the world's best tennis.
Yeah.
If you want to go to Wimbledon, you have to enter a ballot with hundreds of thousands of people. You have to sleep overnight in a queue to wait out in front to potentially get a ticket. So consumers are blessed with great choice.
Let's fast forward a little bit. Why did AFL become this giant of sport down under? What did they do better than the others?
There's probably a two-part answer, of which obviously there's a whole book dedicated to exploring it. But really, in short, the AFL has been overall by far the best managed code. This dates back to its very origins.
Administration, huh?
Yeah, exactly right. So this dates back to their origins through the Independent Commission of the 1980s. They've been very well governed for the propagation of the game at a national level. Our other three football codes have each been littered with their individual calamities, which I cover.
Mistakes.
Huge mistakes, some forced, some unforced.
Okay, talk to me about, let's go through them. The biggest mistake AFL made?
Look, I probably couldn't even tell you what a specific mistake they've made. If anything, they've been so well run that I couldn't really point to a specific error they've made.
Okay, I would have said to you, they should have allowed Port Adelaide entry in 1990. Rather than force them out till 1997 and allow the creation of the Adelaide Crows. But hey, that's fish and chips.
I suppose if there was a criticism, it's that the NSL was the first national sports league in Australia in the 1970s, predating the AFL by the better part of the decade. So if we were to be critical, we could suggest that maybe the AFL could have formed a national competition a little earlier than it did.
They had too big an internal fight.
That's right.
But they did get it done, which was most interesting. Rugby league, biggest mistake? Was it the Super League Wars, which held them back? Cost a lot of money?
It definitely held them back, but it's arguably not their biggest mistake. Okay. So their biggest mistake, if we look at the long span of history, is its reliance on poker machine money.
Beautifully said.
You know, if we look at what has separated the AFL, half the AFL clubs were broke in the 1980s. The central organisation had $3 million in the bank, not in a very strong position by the start of the Independent Commission. Rugby league's biggest problem is that it's had the ability to rely on poker machine money, which means that the individual clubs, as football operations, haven't had to operate as going concerns. That culture of handouts from poker machine money has basically sustained rugby league for 100 years. And in 2021, they're still not a profitable organisation.
Wow.
Rugby's biggest mistake is probably the
going
pro. Their biggest mistake is most likely after the 2003 World Cup. They're pushing to be the second most popular sport code in the country. They've got a lot of momentum, a lot of household names, $100 million in the bank. They're absolutely ripe for expansion.
But
and instead of using their next broadcast deal in 2006 to get more free-to-air coverage, as they're now doing when it's too late, they renewed their existing deal for another 15 years to 2021. So they've always played it very conservative, taking the bigger Fox Sports broadcast money than trying to get free-to-air coverage. They should have made that leap in 2006 when their popularity was at its peak.
And football, the round ball code?
The round ball code, their biggest mistake was probably not capitalising on being the first mover in terms of forming a national league. So their national league was never likely to, defeat the AFL or rugby league, but they had first mover advantage for the better part of the decade. And what really held them back was including existing ethnicised clubs that didn't really have the administrative structure or finance to really sustain what they were trying to achieve. So if they had invested a little more on the front end, getting the initial structure right, they would still be around today potentially, much like the NBL is, and they would be in a better position than they are in 2021.
We always hear about football or soccer as the sleeping giant. Why does it have this particular moniker? Is it because it is the world game?
I think it has this moniker to give its fans hope that there is some future out there in which the giant awakens, achieves prosperity, and Australian soccer fans are vindicated that they are supporting the right.
It was worth the wait.
That's right. So undoubtedly, when the media or people use the term sleeping giant, it refers to the fact that Australian soccer or football has this latent potential that is somewhat based on what we see overseas, somewhat based on what we see based on participation numbers. But that has been true for over 40 years and nothing has yet changed.
It's interesting you say that, because I've been watching the MLS in America, and for a great many years people were saying it was never going to make an impact. And it took its women's team to win the world title to actually shake America and open America up. The inroads America is making, the arrival of programs such as Ted Lasso, which suddenly brings that game to a different audience through a different medium, is, I think, the most illuminating thing that they're doing. And it may see football, the round ball code, arise in America in a way, and it'll filter down here. That's the thing that excites me.
I think there's a few crucial distinctions between Australia and American sport marketplace. Overall, quite similar in terms of a strong concentration of various leagues. But when the one critical difference between the A-League and the MLS is that the MLS was able to get people like David Beckham, Wayne Rooney, and really those superstar players, and even go back to Pele. So America, exactly. So America has the scale to try get these superstars, and we saw that with Del Piero for Sydney FC when we were able to get a somewhat superstar here as well. So that's a really big distinction that's helped the MLS over a period of time. But certainly the women's game has been incredible for US soccer, and Matildas very much have that same potential for Australian football here as well.
That's very exciting stuff. Did you ever imagine that the rugby union would go professional? The game played in heaven?
I think the reality is whether it's been good or bad for rugby is a different question from whether it had to happen. And the answer is it was inevitable. Kerry Packer was forming a World Rugby Corporation that was planning on rating these amateur players, signing up to contracts. And it was inevitable that World Rugby had to go professional because towards the end of the 90s, and if they didn't sign them, half the All Blacks would have ended up in rugby league.
Hunter, for me, I'm a Sydney boy, and I've always seen Sydney as a little bit different marketplace. I grew up Randwick, my rugby union club, my cricket club. I played district cricket for Randwick. I knew them as the Galloping Greens. I knew them as a side that was filled with internationals, whether it was Hawthorn, whether it was the great Johnny Brass, Phil Smith, Campo, the Ella brothers, Fairfax, the whole box and dice. And yet I saw some of them also go to rugby league. So rugby union, to me, I understand where you say it was inevitable that they had to go professional, but part of me wished they hadn't. It was like there was a natural order to things. And do you think they had to eventually go that way, or fall aside?
Well, I mean, I suppose it all depends on your organisation's objectives. It's not a golden rule that a sport has to be a professional sport. A lot of sport NSOs exist just for the purposes of participation and recreation, and don't necessarily have to endeavour to have $1 million contracts.
But more and more young boys and girls want to play that sport. The only way they can do it is if it's career driven, if there is a pathway.
And this has been one of the big strategic weaknesses of rugby union. We spent some time in the book looking at the financials of the Australian Rugby Union over a 40-year period of time. And what it shows is that investment in junior development has basically shrunken to its lowest levels. So there's a lot of critics of rugby in terms of its investment in community sport. And unfortunately, the data supports that they just haven't really reinvested in getting those junior levels developed.
Can you see the code wars going away anytime soon?
I can,
really,
alarmingly, and I think one very significant issue is concussion. So if a lot of people consider concussion to be the next smoking, if the science develops such that there's no acceptable level of concussion that a human can have, that's manageable. How do we play rugby? What happens to contact sports in that scenario if concussion is the new smoking? Aside from structural macro level things that might affect the code wars.
So the mums and dads of tomorrow could well decide which way the battle for the codes goes.
That's right. We're already seeing in America participation in American football is declining precipitously because people are more and more aware of the safety risks.
And they're going to soccer, aren't they?
That's right. And so that's a huge structural level challenge, but even more fundamentally, the management of the smaller codes might have them revert from the mainstream.
Before we wrap this up, and I wish you all the very, very best, you're getting underway. When does the book launch?
Book launch is March 17th. at North Sydney Oval, a very fabled battleground of the football codes themselves.
I played cricket at North Sydney Oval.
There you go.
Know it well.
Brilliant oval. So that's our launch, and the book will be available from Fair Play Publishing and all good bookstores.
I think it's a tremendous read, and I love the subject matter. What I want to know is that I've seen recently, and I want to know if you cover it because I didn't see it. The new streaming service, Sportsflix.
Yes.
It's just got out there and bamboozled some of the biggest broadcasters and media platforms by doing the unheard of, which was grabbing the rights for the European Championships.
That's right. So the book, the third part of the book focuses on the future of the codes, which includes the streaming environment for rugby.
So streaming the future?
Streaming is broadly the future. The thing to keep in mind is that it took Foxtel 10 years to turn its maiden profit. So we can't, a sport league that wants to open its own streaming service can't expect to make a profit overnight. That requires capital reserves that many of our sports, to be honest, don't really have. So risk and reward.
Okay. Is there a chance for the codes to become their own sportscaster? Like the Major League Baseball in America, which owns the whole box and dice.
Absolutely, there's a chance, and the smartest way to do that will be to collaborate. Something like a summer-winter sport collaboration to optimize your technology usage and production usage would make sense. I mean, to be honest, it's not even necessarily for the small sports. If the AFL and cricket decide to collaborate and walk away from Foxtel, that would be the end of Fox Sports as we know it, and then they could quite easily have their own application in their own right. So it's not necessarily just the small sports getting a window in, it could conceivably be the big sports too.
So your advice to all those administrators out there is?
Read the book and
think ahead.
Think ahead.
And be bold.
Absolutely.
We're talking to Hunter Fujak in the studio at TheInformer, and there's one question before we go. I've got to ask you. I've been sitting on it for a while. Who would you rather be? Gillon McLaughlin, Andy Abdo, Andy Marinos, or James Johnson, the head honcho, the CEO of Football Australia?
I think if it was me enjoying a challenge, it would be Andy at Rugby Australia, because Gil has to just keep running a steady ship on the forward march of progress that the AFL seems unstoppable upon. Football Australia, even if the A-League doesn't quite succeed, there's a base of participation which will keep soccer relevant in this country going forward. But it's really rugby union that's really at a precipice at this moment in time. If they don't get the next 3 years right with their streaming deal, there's a chance that by 2030 rugby exits the mainstream.
Wow. Hunter, once again, thank you very much for joining us and for answering all the hard questions too.
Brilliant.
Hunter Fujak on The Informer, talking about his terrific new book, Code Wars. Make sure you check it out. And it launches March 17. Thank you, mate.
Thanks.